The brown envelope on my desk made no sound, but I knew what was inside could shake an entire company. I used to believe that if I worked hard, stayed disciplined, and proved my competence, fairness would eventually find me. But when I discovered that a young man with no experience, the CEO's son, was being paid far more than I was, simply because of his last name, I understood something chilling. Some systems are not broken. They are designed to be unfair from the beginning. The brown envelope on my desk looked so ordinary that anyone passing by would not have looked at it twice. It had no special seal, no legal logo, no warning printed across the front. It was just a standard office envelope, the kind people used for internal documents, invoices, meeting notes, or paperwork no one truly wanted to read. But I knew what was inside was not harmless. The 3 printed pages tucked into that envelope could tear open the polished image Precision Components Inc. had spent years presenting to its workforce. My name is Clara Bennett. I am 49 years old. A woman who spent 8 years in the military and more than 22 years inside factories, production lines, operations meetings, and crisis rooms most executives had never seen up close. Until 72 hours earlier, I believed I had finally found a company that valued competence over connections. I believed my discipline, my experience, and my ability to stay steady under pressure would finally count for something. I was wrong. Not slightly wrong, but so wrong it almost became absurd. To understand why that envelope mattered, I have to go back 3 weeks. To the morning, I walked into Precision Components facility in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, carrying a very simple hope to do the work well, stabilize my life, and prove that an experienced woman with real operational knowledge still had value in a corporate world obsessed with talking about future potential. 3 weeks earlier, I arrived at Precision Components wearing my most professional suit, serious and cautious in the way I always approached a new environment. The company manufactured precision parts for aerospace and automotive clients. It had around 280 employees, steady contracts, a respectable reputation, and the appearance of a well-run organization. The recruiter had described the senior operations manager role as if it had been written specifically for me. They said they needed someone who understood production discipline, safety, efficiency, process control, and people. I heard those words and thought, finally, a place that understood experience was not just a number on a resume. The salary offer was $68,000 a year. It was not exciting, but for the area, it seemed fair enough. More importantly, the job was close enough to where my ex-husband lived that I could still see my children regularly. After the divorce 2 years earlier, staying close to my kids mattered more than any bonus. My first day unfolded like most first days: badge photo, system access, safety orientation, culture, presentation, and the impossible task of remembering too many names before lunch. My direct supervisor was Mark Rivera, a calm man who seemed methodical and knew the production metrics well enough. He walked me through the third-floor offices, explained reporting lines, pointed out departments, and introduced me to the operations group. As we passed a cluster of desks near the windows, Mark said I would be working with some of the new talent the company had brought in recently. Something about the way he emphasized those words caught my attention, though I did not yet understand where it would lead. The new talent turned out to be a group of young employees barely out of college, placed into roles that, in my experience, usually required at least 5 to 7 years of real operational exposure. One of them was Ethan Walker, 26 years old, expensively dressed, confident in his handshake, and wearing the easy smile of someone who did not seem to know what it felt like to have doors slammed in his face. Mark introduced him casually. Ethan, this is Clara Bennett. She will be handling production oversight and efficiency protocols. Ethan joined us 3 weeks ago as a production supervisor. I remember keeping my face neutral. Though a quiet alarm sounded in my head, production supervisor was not a role for experimenting. It required understanding line rhythm, data, variance, people, and the consequences of a poor decision, delaying an entire shipment. I asked Ethan where he had worked before. He smiled and said this was his first real job. Aside from a few months of consulting after graduation, his first real job, and he was already a production supervisor. I had spent years reaching similar roles. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because manufacturing operations did not forgive innocence. I only said, "Welcome to the real world." If you have ever seen someone unqualified placed too high because someone powerful was protecting them, comment. The number one. So I know I am not the only one who has witnessed it. The first week passed in the familiar chaos of a new job, learning systems, reading procedures, understanding information flow, and figuring out who actually worked versus who only performed well in meetings. Every company had its strange habits, and precision was no different. But what began to bother me was not the outdated systems or the confusing file names. It was how often Ethan appeared beside my desk with his laptop open and a look that was half confused, half carefree. "Clara, can you look at this efficiency variance report? I am not sure how to calculate the percentage difference." "Lauder?" he asked, why his production schedule did not match the actual numbers. Another day. He asked me to explain the difference between cycle time and takt time. Two foundational concepts any production supervisor should understand before walking into a first planning meeting. I was not someone who hated helping new employees. In the military and in manufacturing, I had trained many people, and I knew everyone had to start somewhere. But there was a major difference between someone learning a company's internal procedures and someone who did not understand the foundation of the role they had been hired to perform. By the end of the first week, I had explained lean manufacturing principles to Ethan, shown him how to read overall equipment effectiveness, and nearly rebuilt two of his efficiency reports from scratch because his original analysis made no mathematical sense. Each time, Ethan smiled and called me a lifesaver. I smiled too. But inside, I began asking myself a hard question. Why was I teaching someone at my level how to do the very job he was being paid to perform? By the second week, my quiet irritation had become real suspicion. Early Tuesday morning, I came into the office to build a complex efficiency model for a major client. The building was almost empty, with only a few early employees scattered across the desks, and the white office lights reflected off the glass in a way that made everything feel cold and sharp. I needed 3 years of historical production data. The Mark had told me it was all stored in the shared operations drive, organized by project and fiscal period. I logged in, opened folder after folder, found the client directory, and entered an archive covering the period from 2019 through 2024. Dozens of files appeared on my screen: production reports, client presentations, efficiency analyses, audit documents. I scrolled down looking for the data I needed, and then I saw a file that did not belong there. It was an internal compensation analysis for the operations department. I knew I should have closed it. I knew it was not meant for me. But the military taught me one rule I never forgot before entering dangerous terrain. Understand the ground beneath your feet. An internal compensation file misplaced inside a production archive was not a small thing. I opened it. Before I go further, if this story makes you want to know how deeply companies can hide the truth, please like this video. Because sometimes a single like helps stories about fairness travel farther. The spreadsheet opened in front of me with the cold clarity of raw data. Employee names, titles, departments, hire dates, 2 years of experience, and annual base salaries. Everything was neat, organized, and emotionless. I scrolled slowly, recognizing names I had learned over the past 2 weeks and matching faces to numbers. Then I saw my own entry. Clara Bennett, Senior Operations Manager, Operations Department, hired in mid-January, 2024. 22 years of experience. Annual base salary of $68,000. Exactly what my offer letter said. Nothing surprising. I kept scrolling. A few rows later, Ethan Walker appeared. Production Supervisor. Operations Department. Hired 1 week before me. 0 years of relevant experience. Annual base salary of $85,000. I stared at the number for a long time, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too clearly. $85,000, roughly a quarter more than I was making. Same job level. Less real responsibility. No operational experience. No certification. No record proving competence. In that moment, the sound of the air conditioner, distant keyboards, and the coffee machine in the hall seemed to fade away. All I could see were 2 lines of data side by side, 22 years of experience valued below a last name. I clicked the personnel profile linked to Ethan's name. Date of birth. To degree in industrial engineering. Recent graduate. Short internship at a family-related business. No certifications. No relevant experience. The special note froze everything in place. Executive referral. Priority hire. I opened the detailed note, and the answer appeared so clearly, there was no room left for explanation. Ethan had been referred by CEO Charles Walker. He had been approved for accelerated placement with a premium compensation package under something called a Strategic Talent Acquisition Initiative. I sat still in front of the screen for several seconds. Ethan Walker. Charles Walker. The CEO's son. The phrase strategic talent suddenly felt hollow and ridiculous. This was not human resources strategy. This was nepotism wrapped in corporate language. Approved at the highest level. Then hidden inside files ordinary employees were never supposed to see. I had spent 8 years learning leadership in the military. Then more than 2 decades building production systems. Training teams. Handling safety. Protecting deadlines. Facing audits. And solving crises. Ethan was being paid more because he had been born into the right family, but I did not stop with Ethan. Once I saw the trail, I had to know where it led. I kept scrolling through the spreadsheet, matching each name to the faces. I was still learning. Megan Hayes, junior analyst, only 18 months out of college, $72,000. Referred by the Vice President of Business Development, Owen Reed. Associate Supervisor, 24 years old, $78,000. Nephew of Mark Rivera. Meanwhile, the people actually keeping the production floor from collapsing were being paid shockingly little. A manufacturing analyst with 12 years of experience earned $62,000. A lead operations specialist with 15 years earned $64,000. A production manager who had kept the company audit ready for a decade earned $71,000. This was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a system. I printed the spreadsheet, and my hands did not shake. Some people assume that when women are angry, they lose control, cry, raise their voices, or act purely from emotion. But I had lived long enough to know the most dangerous anger is quiet. I folded the pages, slipped them into my jacket, logged out of the system, and sat for several minutes in the nearly empty office. The numbers kept moving through my mind. Not as money, but as evidence of human value being distorted. I thought about employees who had worked there for years. People who might have accepted tiny raises because they believed the company was struggling. I thought about mothers, fathers, caregivers, people paying rent, medical bills, and tuition. While leadership used words like potential to push money toward their own relatives, then I stood up and went straight to human resources. The HR department was on the second floor, decorated with polished posters about teamwork, excellence, and valuing people. At that moment, those words looked like satire. The HR director was Diane Brooks, a woman in her 50s who looked as if she had spent years making problems disappear before they created waves. Her office door was open. I told her I needed to discuss a compensation issue. Her smile froze for a moment, quickly enough that an inexperienced person might not notice. But I noticed. She invited me to sit. I placed the folded pages on her desk so that only 2 lines were visible, mine and Ethan's. If you have not subscribed yet, subscribe now so you can keep following stories where the truth finally forces its way into the open. I told Diane I had accidentally accessed the file while looking for production data. and I wanted a reasonable explanation for why someone hired 1 week before me, with no relevant experience and the same job level, was being paid so much more than I was. Diane looked down at the page. For a fraction of a second, her professional expression remained intact, but her body betrayed her. Her shoulders stiffened, her hands stopped moving, and her eyes became calculating. It was the reaction of someone who had just realized she was standing in a minefield. She said my name slowly and reminded me that the document contained confidential personnel information I was not authorized to access. I said I understood. But now that I had seen it, the question was no longer whether I should have seen it. The question was why that compensation structure existed. Diane began using the kind of language I had heard too many times in my life. Compensation decisions were based on many complex factors: market conditions, role complexity, growth, trajectory, strategic value, individual negotiation outcomes. The words were smooth, but they answered nothing. I asked directly. Ethan had no relevant experience. The same job level as mine. And I had more than 22 years of manufacturing operations experience. Which complex factor justified that gap? Diane said she could not discuss another employee's compensation because of confidentiality policy. I replied that we could discuss mine. Then, had I been hired below market while the CEO's son, who was not qualified for the position, received a premium salary package? The room went silent. And in that silence, I heard the answer more clearly than any confession. Diane did not admit it. But she did not deny it either. That was what I noticed most. After a long pause, she said she understood why. From my perspective, the situation might seem inequitable. That choice of words chilled me. Not unfair. Only seemingly unfair. Not wrong. Only a personal perception. She continued by saying Precision operated in a competitive environment, and sometimes attracting high-potential talent required premium packages that reflected future value rather than current experience. I repeated the phrase high-potential talent and asked whether that was what they called nepotism now. At that moment, Diane's polite surface disappeared completely. She stood, opened her office door, and said the conversation was over. She emphasized that I had been at Precision for exactly 10 days. So, I should focus on learning my responsibilities, instead of concerning myself with compensation strategy decisions above my level. Then she offered me 2 choices: accept the position I had signed for or resign. I stood slowly, looked her directly in the eyes, and told her I understood. But as I walked out of HR, my heart was not pounding from fear. It was pounding because something had become clearer than anger. Diane was wrong. I did not have only 2 choices. I had a third. The military taught me that when facing a stronger force, you do not charge directly at it. You gather intelligence, understand the weak point, choose the moment, and strike where they are unprepared. Diane had just made a serious tactical mistake. She thought I was a new employee who could be intimidated. She did not understand that I had survived enough bad commanders, production crise, and silent battles to know when to stop asking permission. That night, I sat in my apartment and began building a file. Not a lawsuit. At least not yet. I called it an intelligence dossier. I opened my laptop, pulled up the compensation spreadsheet I had saved in personal storage, and began cross-checking every name. LinkedIn profiles, company bios, market salary data, professional certifications, education history, prior experience. I worked with cold, steady focus, like the nights I used to spend on military duty, when one small mistake could compromise an entire operation. The deeper I dug, the clearer and more unacceptable the pattern became. Ethan was not an isolated case. Megan Hayes, daughter of the Vice President of Business Development, had been placed into a junior analyst role with a salary many veterans never reached. Owen Reed, Mark's nephew, received associate supervisor pay despite having little experience. Employees with connections were described as long-term investments, high-potential resources, and strategic talent. Employees with real experience were described as stable, reliable, and budget appropriate. I hated how beautiful words could be used to cover ugly behavior. Precision had built an operating model on underpaying loyal, experienced workers while sending money toward people born closer to power. They relied on employees staying silent because they feared losing jobs, because they were tired, because they had families to support, because they believed one more year of hard work would finally be recognized. I knew that feeling. I had wanted to believe it too. But by that night, I no longer believed it. By 2 in the morning, my report was 28 pages long, clearly formatted, with comparisons, charts, market data, and specific examples showing the gap between relationship-based hiring and merit-based employees. I titled the report in bold Precision Components Inc. A. Comprehensive Analysis of Nepotistic Hiring and Systematic Compensation Discrimination. I did not write it like a complaint. I wrote it as a document the board, regulators, labor attorneys, and every worker in the building could read and understand. Each fact had to stand on its own. Each number needed context. I knew people like Charles Walker and Diane Brooks would try to make me the problem. They would say I was emotional, violating confidentiality, misunderstanding strategy, causing trouble too soon after being hired. Women in operations environments were often labeled quickly, too soft if they were polite, too difficult if they were firm, too threatening if they asked questions. So I gave them no room to turn the story into a debate about my personality. I made it about data. I compared salaries against industry benchmarks. I marked cases where people with little experience earned more than employees with 10, 15, or 20 years of experience. I highlighted notes that said executive referral, priority hire, and premium compensation package. What I saw was not only unfairness, but organizational distortion. When capable people are underpaid and connected, people are protected. The entire system learns to pretend. Strong performers stop trying. Weak performers do not have to learn. Leaders lose credibility. Eventually, the company rots from the inside while still hanging posters about excellence in the hallway. Near dawn, I printed 5 copies, one for Charles Walker, one for my records, one ready for the Department of Labor, one ready for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and one, in the broadest sense, for every person in the building who had been forced to undervalue themselves. The next morning, I woke at 4:15 without an alarm. My body knew that kind of waking from my military years, when a clear objective pushed sleep aside automatically. I showered, put on my sharpest clothes, tied my hair back, and drove to Precision while the sky was still dark. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few vehicles belonging to the overnight cleaning crew. I badged into the building and crossed the lobby with the controlled stride. My trainers once called calm under pressure, Calvin Moore. The security guard sat behind the desk and barely looked up from an old novel. He only said I was starting early. I told him I had a major project deadline. Nothing more was needed. I took the elevator to the executive floor. Charles Walker's office sat at the end of the hallway behind double doors with his name engraved on polished metal. The handle was locked, as expected, but I knew his executive assistant, Laura Simmons, kept emergency keys in her desk for urgent deliveries. I had seen her use them during my first week when Mark needed to drop off documents after hours. The assistant area was dark and quiet. I opened the drawer carefully, found the key labeled CEO office, unlocked the doors, and stepped into Charles Walker's world. The room said plenty about its owner. Tall windows overlooking Lancaster's industrial district. Expensive leather chairs. A desk so clean, it looked more like a photo set than a place where work happened. On the credenza were pictures of Charles with local politicians, with his wife at charity events, and with Ethan at graduation. I placed the sealed brown envelope directly in the center of his desk, with only my name written on the outside in black ink. No threat, no drama, just the truth, placed exactly where it belonged. I locked the door again, returned Laura's key to the same drawer, and left the executive floor as if no one had ever been there. But I did not go home. I returned to my desk on the 3rd floor, logged into my computer, and opened my email. The real operation began there. I opened the company directory, which contained all 280 employees. From new administrative staff to senior executives, I started a new message and began adding every person to the recipient line. Some names I knew. Some I had only seen in passing. Some belonged to departments I had not yet visited. But all of them had the right to know how the system was valuing them. The subject line read, Compensation Transparency Report, What Precision Does Not Want You to Know. I attached the full 28-page report and wrote a short message. I told my colleagues they deserved to know their worth, deserved to know what the people beside them were being paid, and deserved to understand why their experience had been minimized while family connections were rewarded. I did not add inflammatory language. The data was powerful enough on its own. My finger paused over the send button. In the military, there is a moment known as the point of no return. Once the action begins, you cannot take it back without accepting the consequences. I thought about my children, about the custody arrangement that depended on stable employment, to about my ex-husband, once saying I did not know how to keep my head down when necessary. I thought about the employees who had emailed me for help with problems Ethan should have been solving. I thought about workers on the production floor doing long shifts, believing their loyalty would eventually be rewarded. And I understood this was not a difficult choice. I clicked send. 280 copies of the truth left my outbox. The storm did not take long to form. By 7:30, the first day shift employees began arriving. By 7:45, I could hear voices in the hallway. Low at first, then quickly becoming urgent. People called across rows of desks, pointed at phones, opened laptops, and printed documents. By 8, my inbox was full of replies. Some asked whether the data was real. Some wrote that they finally understood why they had been denied raises for years. Some said they were sending the report to a spouse because they needed their family to know they had not imagined the unfairness. By 8:15, a crowd had gathered outside the main break room. Someone had printed the key pages and taped them to the wall. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Ethan had been there only a few weeks and earned more than someone who had worked there for 8 years. Megan made more than a veteran specialist. Owen was paid as if he had already survived work he had never touched. The energy in the building changed completely. It felt like the moment before a storm, when the pressure drops and everything becomes too still before thunder breaks. People were not only angry about money, they were angry because they had been made to believe the problem was them. They had not worked hard enough, negotiated well enough, chosen the right time, or proven themselves sufficiently. My report showed them the game had been rigged before they ever stepped onto the field. At 8:42, Charles Walker's BMW appeared in the executive parking space. I watched from my desk window and knew he was about to find the envelope. Less than 10 minutes later, his voice cut down the third-floor hallway, sharp and furious. The hunt had begun. By 9:15, chaos had spread across every floor. Employees gathered around screens, forwarded the email to personal addresses, and copied the report on every functioning printer in the building. The production floor nearly stalled as groups of workers compared their own stories to the numbers in the report. Promotions denied. Promised raises that never appeared. Years of overtime never properly recognized. All of it suddenly had a structure around it. At 9:28, my desk phone rang. The executive assistant's voice was tight as a wire, ordering me to report to Executive Conference Room 5 immediately. I said I was on my way. I adjusted my jacket, took a slow breath, and walked toward the elevator. The ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual, but I was not shaking. 8 years in the military had taught me to keep my voice steady when powerful people lost control. More than 20 years in manufacturing had taught me that many leaders confused intimidation with management. When I opened the conference room door, 6 people were waiting like a tribunal. Charles Walker sat at the head of the table, silver-haired, expensively dressed, his face red with anger. Diane Brooks clutched a leather folder. Her usual composure cracked into panic. Ethan sat off to one side, looking uncomfortable, as if he had just realized the chair beneath him was not as stable as he believed. Mark Rivera was there too, his expression difficult to read. Somewhere between concern and resignation, two men in dark suits sat beside Charles. Obviously attorneys. Laura Simmons sat near the door with her laptop open, ready to document everything. No one invited me to sit. Charles did not waste time. He asked what the hell I thought I was doing. I answered, providing transparency. Charles said I had stolen confidential company data. I corrected him immediately. I had accessed a file that was improperly stored in a shared directory my account had permission to open. I had documented truthful compensation information and shared it internally with the people affected by those decisions. He said I had no right. This time, I interrupted him. I said that if he wanted to turn transparency into a punishable offense, he could try. But I would make sure the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Pennsylvania Business Press, and the federal contract administrators associated with the company all received the same report. The room fell completely silent. It was not quietness. It was the feeling of all air being pulled out of a sealed room. Charles's face shifted from red to a deep purple. But he sat down. One attorney leaned forward and began saying I was clearly in violation of policy. I cut him off. Calm, but firm, I said I had viewed data using granted access, documented verifiable facts, and shared it internally. If they wanted to fire me for telling employees the truth about how they were being paid, I would turn that decision into evidence of retaliation. The attorney closed his mouth. Charles asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted them to fix it. Not with an empty apology. Not with a secret review. I demanded market rate salary corrections for every underpaid experienced employee. Retroactive back pay for the previous 3 fiscal years. Transparent salary bands. An independent audit of all compensation practices. And a written policy prohibiting nepotistic hiring without documented qualification. I looked at each person in the room and knew they understood. This was no longer an HR conversation. This was the moment the company had to choose between correction and exposure. One of the attorneys tried to object, but I raised my hand and continued before he could build another wall of language. I said that if they failed to act, I would leave the building. Send the report to the Lancaster Intelligencer. Post the full analysis on LinkedIn. File formal complaints with the Department of Labor and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And let investors, the board, and federal contract officers decide what they thought of a manufacturing company that paid the unqualified son of the CEO more than a senior manager with more than 22 years of experience. No one spoke. Diane looked as if she wanted to disappear. Ethan stared down at the table, his ears red. Charles looked at me as if I had set fire to his office. But I had not started the fire. I had simply opened the door so everyone could see the smoke that had been there for years. Finally, he said I had been there 2 weeks and thought I could walk into his company and destroy everything he had built. I told him I had destroyed nothing. He built the system, approved the compensation packages, allowed it to continue. And I had only turned on the lights. When he coldly said I was fired, I responded almost immediately. Perfect. I would add retaliatory termination to the complaints I was filing that afternoon. And discovery in litigation would be very interesting. Charles ground his teeth. Diane leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear. Her face gray. After a few seconds, Charles said the company would review the compensation structure internally and that everything had to remain inside those walls. I said that depended on how honest and comprehensive their corrections were. Before leaving, I looked at Ethan and told him this was not entirely personal. He had not set his own salary, but he had not earned it either. Then, I gave them 72 hours. I walked out of the conference room and heard Charles slam his hand onto the table so hard, the sound carried down the hallway like a gunshot. I did not look back. By noon, my email had been forwarded outside the company to former colleagues, industry contacts, and people who had suspected Precision had problems but never had proof. By early afternoon, a business reporter from the Lancaster Intelligencer contacted me on LinkedIn, asking whether I would comment on allegations concerning compensation practices at Precision Components. By late afternoon, the board of directors held an emergency closed-door meeting. That evening, a company-wide email went out, not from Charles, but from the interim board chair. The message said Precision would immediately begin an independent audit of all compensation structures, and every employee would be contacted individually within 96 hours regarding adjustments, correction, and retroactive back pay where appropriate. They wrote that the company was committed to transparency, equity, and fair treatment for every team member regardless of tenure, background, or personal relationships. I read the email twice while sitting in my truck in the parking lot. I did not celebrate. I went home and opened my laptop to search for a job. 3 weeks later, Mark texted me that salary corrections had gone through and back pay had hit accounts. He said several people cried when they saw the numbers. He wrote that I had changed lives. A few hours later, he added that Ethan had resigned after the board gave him a choice: leave voluntarily or be terminated for misrepresenting his qualifications. That evening, a woman named Grace Miller, a senior financial controller, messaged me to say Charles Walker had stepped down as CEO because of governance failures and accountability issues. Diane Brooks had also been asked to resign. I read those messages on my couch, laptop open in front of me, and for the first time in days, I smiled. 4 months later, I accepted a position at a competitor. They had reached out after reading about the Precision transparency incident in industry publications. The new compensation package was $89,000 a year, significantly higher than what Precision had offered me. Not because of my last name, not because I was someone's daughter, niece, or family friend in the executive suite. Because of my experience. On my first day, the plant manager shook my hand and said they did not hire people based on who they were related to. They hired people based on what they could do. He said that from everything they had seen, I was the kind of person who made organizations better simply by refusing to accept mediocrity. I remembered that sentence for a long time, because that was all I had ever wanted, to be measured by what I could do, not by how quietly I could endure being undervalued. Some systems do not change because people ask politely. They do not change because a small complaint disappears into an HR drawer. They change when someone decides not to remain a silent witness anymore. The military taught me that sometimes you must choose between following orders and doing what is right. Precision told me to accept their broken system or leave. I chose neither. I forced them to look at what they had built. The envelope on my desk that day contained more than a few printed pages. It contained proof that experience has value. Fairness is worth fighting for. And sometimes, the best way to protect the people around you is to refuse to let the truth stay buried. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, please leave one like and subscribe to the channel so you can keep following stories where the truth is no longer forced to stay silent.